Welcome back, everyone. Now today I've got an absolute treat for all you watch fans out there. I'm in the presence, if you don't mind me saying, of an absolute legend, James Dowling, the one and only. How you doing, James?
I'm almost human. How are you?
That's a great, mate. The check is the check going to be in the post for that one? That was a great intro, right?
Yeah. All right. Fine. Yeah. Okay.
So we haven't seen James since the Brighton Watch Show, but he's here today with our good friend Spencer from BQ Watches.
Good afternoon, Paul.
Oh, I'm all good, Spencer. I'm looking forward to this one. James, thanks for taking a bit of time out for us this afternoon to have a little bit of chat. I think that there's going to be a lot of people out there today watching this with great interest. The first question I've got for you today, take us right back to the very beginning. Where did your love and affection and passion for watches start?
Well, it was just after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, bizarrely, this year I will have been married 40 years this year. And when I met my wife, I wasn't really into watches. I wasn't into watches at all. I owned two watches. I had a GMT Master and I had a Cartier Tank. And those watches were all I needed. I didn't need anything else. I didn't think of it, it just never occurred to me.
So James, going back, so this is sort of mid-80s, is it?
This is early 80s.
Early 80s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And life went on. I had no interest in watches really, other than as tools to put on my wrist, either when I was wearing a suit or when I wasn't. And one day I was out with what was then my future wife and a friend in a bar, and my wife didn't own a watch at all. She saw a watch on a friend's wrist and said, "Oh, that's a lovely watch. Tell me about it." And he told her, and it was a vintage Rolex. And it was coming up to our first anniversary, and I thought, what can I buy my wife? And I thought, I'll buy her a vintage Rolex. So I went down to Portobello, futzed around, found somebody, bought an old Rolex.
James, you know the problem there? It was probably Paul Thorpe you bought it from back in those days.
Do you remember who you bought it from?
I think I bought it from Maurice Saldana.
Okay, yeah. Is that...
the Indian guy.
Yeah.
And, of course, to reciprocate, she bought me a vintage watch. She bought me a Harwood, the first automatic wristwatch. And I've always had a sort of need to know. And so I decided to research about Harwood. And then I started researching about early automatic wristwatches. And that's what started me collecting. I started with Harwoods, Wigwags, Perpetual Watch, Auto Wrist, all of those sort of things. That got me going. And what happened from there was that I bought an early Rolex automatic, the Bubbleback. And out of all of those watches from that early 30s period, the Bubbleback was the only one that actually worked. And so I thought, well, I'll start collecting Bubblebacks then. So I started to collect Bubblebacks, and then I started to collect other early Rolex. And
James, back in those days, what sort of number, can you remember the price of what things were, these Bubblebacks?
Well, yeah. Very simple. I know that it was 2 or 3 years into collecting watches before I ever paid more than £1,000 for any watch, and it was really a tough bridge to cross, was to pay £1,000 for a watch.
Right.
The Bubblebacks had a bit of a niche collecting area.
Yes, there was a. When I started collecting, and probably for the first. Up until the end of the 80s, maybe the middle of the 90s, the most desirable Rolex watches to collect were two. There was the Bubbleback and there was the Rolex Prince. Those were the watches that everybody wanted. You could get 2 or 3 Daytonas for the price of a nice Rolex Prince.
Yeah. What made the Bubblebacks so special for you? Was it the fact that it was automatic, or was it the fact that the case?
It was essentially the it was the nexus, it was the beginning of every modern Rolex we see nowadays. It was automatic, it was waterproof, and it was a chronometer. So you could stick it on your wrist and you never had to think about it.
And they came in a lot of glazes, didn't they? Different metals, red gold, pink, yellow gold, steel.
Hooded ones.
Yeah.
And the different shapes of hoods. There was wonderful dials. I mean, the dial we see, that everybody goes crazy over, the so-called California dial, began on the bubble backs. I mean, all of this stuff, there was so much going around then. Now most of it seems to have vanished into Japanese collections, never to be seen again.
Yeah. I think a lot of that happened sort of mid 2015, 2010 to 2015.
No, I think it's a bit earlier than that.
A bit earlier, yeah.
It was because all of this stuff stopped when the Japanese economy collapsed, with what they call the bubble economy. That went away at the beginning of of this century.
Yeah.
And then things changed, and we went from the idea of a 31 millimeter watch on a man's wrist suddenly to Panerais at 50 millimeters on your wrist, and it was just like, and suddenly watches like the bubble back and the Prince were seen as girly watches.
But years ago, I mean, I remember one of my first date watch was a 31mm Datejust. People who didn't have a big wrist would wear a 31mm. Now it's women that barely wear a 31mm.
Yeah. Well, we talk about the variations, James, and you mentioned hooded bubble backs, etc., the different case variants, dials. I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if you do, but how did Rolex manufacture back then? I mean, did they produce a particular amount of numbers? Because it's just so much different back then than it is today.
Well, this is something that you have to understand, is that Rolex now and Rolex up until the 60s are utterly and completely different companies.
Absolutely.
Rolex now have 4 factories, including their BN movement factory. They have 3 big factories in Geneva. Up until the 60s, they had something like 27 factories. So they were all small firms they'd taken over, and they each produced components or something of that nature. But for example, a lot of the bubble backs, the cases weren't even made by Rolex. Rolex had a case factory called Genex, which was one of the first companies they took over.
Also had I remember a lot of Denison cases.
Yes.
That's something that you came across.
But the Denison cases come from 2 periods. There was the World War I period, the silver case ones, and then after World War II, like we were talking about earlier about having bracelets manufactured in different countries, they made a lot of Denison cased watches in Birmingham. They made the cases in Birmingham because import duties were so expensive. So by making the gold case in the UK and then just putting a Swiss dial and movement in it, it meant that 51% or more of the watch was English value. Therefore, it wasn't classed as an import.
Right. That's why you find so many vintage Rolex models with a UK hallmark. People often wonder why it's got a UK hallmark when it's a Swiss watch. That's why. And
often, in fact, the cases will be made in the UK, and often, sometimes not even signed Rolex, they'll just be signed Denison, or SS and Co.
Yeah, absolutely. Seen loads of them in my time. Yeah. What do you think that your favourite period is? I mean, James, author of books, etc., the best in time, one of the best books I've ever read. There's so many different periods for me when we talk about Rolex. Which would you say is your personal favourite? Do you have a soft spot for a particular period?
I have, I love the 50s and 60s because Rolex was still experimenting then. They were still doing, for want of a better word, weird shit. They've completely stopped doing that. Actually, they just started doing this 1908 watch, which I think is wonderful because it's them trying something different that they haven't done for ages. So, but from the mid-60s up until last year, Rolex have been narrowing their product range and bringing everything into line and being very straightforward and straight down the line. What I loved about the 50s and 60s is there was so much strange stuff. You could, one particular model would come with like 6 different case styles. It was just, they were experimenting with movements. You could have, if you look at a period like 1958, in the catalogue was the 6062 star dial moon phase triple calendar, which used essentially the bubble back movement. Then the majority of the watches were using the 1035 so-called butterfly movement, but they'd already gone on to watches like the 5508, which were already used in the 1530. So you had 3 generations of movements all being made at the same time. Now everything is bang. It has either this movement, and that's it. There's no changes.
It's amazing going back. I remember coming across some of the Daytonas, dated like you would date them 63, and the papers might be dated 67. I mean, they didn't sell in those days, did they?
The reason the Daytona is valuable now is because they didn't make many of them, and they didn't make many of them because they couldn't sell many.
That's amazing. I know.
The story is in my book, and I must have told it a million times, but when I bought my very first Rolex, which I said was a GMT Master, it was from where the Patek boutique is on Bond Street.
Yeah.
That was Watches of Switzerland. That was their big store at the time. I went in there on a GMT Master, and guy pulled one out of the drawer because it wasn't. That was then. You wanted a watch, you bought it. You went in and bought it. Your only choice was, do you want a Jubilee bracelet or do you want
and that was the wrong bracelet. Was back in the day.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul, we've discussed this. Whenever someone would turn up to me with a GMT on a Jubilee, it's on the wrong bracelet.
Yeah.
That's how it was considered, wasn't it? It was a disaster.
In many respects, yeah. I mean, James, go on, carry on.
And so brings the watch out. I reach in my pocket to get my wallet out and take out my Barclay card, because that was the only credit card there was at that time, Barclay card.
Yeah. And they took the imprint on the machine?
Yeah, on the machine. You had to sign it, 3 carbon papers, all that stuff. And the guy told me, I think it was 200 and something pounds.
I bet it was a discount as well. You got a discount?
I said, it occurred to me, I said, well, if I pay cash, is there a discount? I said, no, I'm sorry, sir, we don't discount Rolex watches. Unless you want a Daytona, I can give you 20% on a Daytona.
But did you take it?
No.
There you go. You see, even the best didn't know back then. Look, we're all guilty of that, right?
The point was that...
What period was this, James?
This would have been
80s?
81.
Okay.
The thing what you have to understand is that nobody bought a Daytona as their first Rolex. People probably had one already. When they put a Daytona on their wrist, they thought, what the hell?
Was this
No, the thing was that in everybody's mind, a Rolex is 3 things. It's a chronometer, it's automatic, and it's waterproof. And the Daytona was none of those.
Yeah.
It didn't have a date on it.
Yeah.
It wasn't waterproof.
And it was manual winding.
Wind. It was like it was stepping back in time, as far as Rolex, as far as most people who owned a Rolex were concerned.
I think what James is saying resonates with me a hell of a lot, because when I was younger, and my dad, we used to look at watches together, the variation and the willingness to experiment with Rolex back in the 60s and the 70s was, for me, so much more exciting. Different materials, different dials. And also, James, the ladies' models that a lot of modern-day collectors will never dream were Rolex.
What's really funny, of course, is that watch collecting is a man's game. So we don't look at women's watches. But 2 things to think about, two statistics. One is the single most popular Rolex model made is the two-tone ladies Datejust.
69173.
And if you look at a 1950s or 1960s catalogue, women's models outnumber men's by a factor of 2 to 3, or 3 to 2.
Yeah.
Sorry, you'll there are pages and pages and pages of women's models, and by far the most expensive watches in there are women's because they are
they're almost piece unique. Some of them, aren't they?
The stuff from the 50s and 60s, it's an era of what we call cocktail watches, and they were essentially pieces of jewellery with a little manual wind movement in the middle of them.
Tiny little movement, but the exterior was stunning, diamond encrusted, rubies, diamonds, whatever, beyond your wildest imagination. Marvellous period. James, I want to talk to you about something that's people are always asking me this subject, and who better to ask than yourself? Rolex servicing of vintage watches. I think this is a very, very important topic. What's your opinion on that?
Well, Rolex kind of put themselves in a bind by having fixed pricing for servicing. So, if you buy a Submariner, you know exactly for the next 10 years how much it's going to cost you to get serviced. I mean, you may have to pay extra if you want a new glass or new hands or whatever, but essentially it's fixed pricing.
Base figure,
it's a base figure. And it then runs into a problem when you have vintage pieces. So Rolex decided to do what Patek and lots of other brands have been doing for ages, which is to price their servicing on a parts and labour basis, in the same way that if you take a 50-year-old Jaguar XK150 in for servicing, the local Jaguar dealer is not going to service it for the same sort of costs it costs you to get your XK8 or whatever done. So essentially Rolex are doing now in their heritage department what pretty much every other brand has been doing for a long time. It's just that their prices are bloody expensive, unless of course you've tried to have a Patek serviced. And the simple truth is that Patek and Rolex are in the same town. Their factories are not that much far apart. They have the same labour pool, and I doubt that a watchmaker who works for Patek earns 50% more than a watchmaker who works for Rolex. He might earn 5% more, but I doubt it. I think that they'll probably earn the same money, and both companies like to make the same level of profits. So there really isn't a reason why a Rolex being serviced in Geneva the cost of it should be any cheaper than a Patek being serviced in Geneva.
What about the replacement of parts and the necessity for people that are sending vintage watches in for a service with Rolex? For an example, the watch we looked at this morning, if that dial would have been taken out and replaced with a service dial, there are some dangers and some education for the viewers.
Well, that we're talking not so much now about vintage servicing, and about older watches going in for what I call regular service, as from going to the heritage department. If they're going for regular service, then Rolex's attitude is we want the watch to perform exactly as it was when it was new. So if parts need to be replaced, we will replace them. And in the end, we call watches like a Submariner a tool watch, and that's how they look on it. It's a tool. So if the hands need replacing,
they're saying replace them.
They'll replace them. Watchmaker, nobody who works in the servicing department of any watchmaker is hired for their aesthetic sensibilities. They're hired because they're really good watchmakers, and they're told what to do. And the Rolex way of doing things is to replace and...
So you must have seen, in all your years in the business, you must have seen watches that have been, sadly, the value has been destroyed in many instances.
I've seen watches that have been decimated by servicing. I've seen so many. For a long time,
isn't it? It is really
for a long time, people were buying Rolex military subs at military auctions where you would buy them for a few £100. They'd take them into Rolex to get rid of the bezel, the dial and the hands, and have them replaced by regular ones because they look better. They look like
But James,
they look
again,
like a proper submariner.
going back a number of years ago, when things were serviced, they would give you the old parts back. So it's only in recent years, isn't it, where everything's an exchange basis. I mean, they don't even give you bezel inserts back now, do they? Everything is taken. Like, they won't give you any parts back.
I believe that the reason that is because so many people were using those vintage parts, those old parts, to add on to watches to make them look like Rolex. In other words, they're putting them onto fake watches and stuff. Almost everything that happens is usually in the result of somebody doing something nasty, because you can't have nice things because somebody spoils it for you all the time. I don't even remember, Rolex in London used to do authentication certificates.
Yeah.
Yes.
For free.
Well,
Yeah.
when I had my stores, we used to phone up Rolex, the lost and stolen line. You phone through,
Yeah.
and they would fax you back whether a watch was lost or stolen.
Yeah.
Simple as that. You just
Forgive some of the questions, James, because these are for the viewers who are going to say, Paul, why didn't you ask the man this question? So here's a question for you, and it's a question that gets asked a lot of all of us in the trade. How do you spot a fake Rolex, etc.? So just we could sit here all day with that one, couldn't we, right? So as a brief guideline, and I think I know what your answer is going to be, but when someone gives you a special vintage piece in your hand, what do you work off? Is it natural instinct? Is it certain areas, certain aspects? Give us your opinion on that.
Like I said, it's 40 years since I've been farting around with watches, and it's a gut feeling. But here's the truth, is that this morning I was shown that nice gloss dial 5513 Submariner. I looked at it and said, nope, it's wrong.
I saw that straight away, and it's funny because I looked at it and thought that's either a really nice dial or it's either a really nice watch or it's made to look like a. And I agreed with you.
Yeah.
Paul's picked it up and gone, oh my God, that's beautiful. And then I said, hang on a sec. James is going to have a look, and between the three of us, we all had. This is where with vintage, we all had a total difference of opinion, and it wasn't until we all looked at it together. Go on, James. So you tell us what we had to do to.
Well, I had the movement and dial taken out of the case. I then had the dial taken off, and when I examined the dial under a high power loop and checked the back, checked the sides of the dial, I realised it was real. It was in fabulous condition. It had just enough patina, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And what I love about it is that, it's the difference between the professionals and the amateurs. A professional is prepared to admit that he's wrong, because I've been doing this for 40 years and I know that I will make mistakes. I have made mistakes. I'll probably make a mistake today and I'll make mistakes in the future. But the one thing is you learn from the mistakes.
Yeah, every time, yeah.
You move on. And today I learned something. I relearned a lesson that I've known for a long time, but I picked up something new today.
It's an impossible task, isn't it, just to give someone an off-the-cuff answer?
No, there is no off the...
Yeah.
It's time. It takes time.
Time and experience.
And comparing.
We're sitting in an attic somewhere in Radlett with more lights than a Hollywood premiere, which is a weird place to talk about philosophy, but this is a rule I live my life by, which is that knowing what you're good at is really important, but knowing what you're not good at and staying away from it is even more important. So,
James, I wish I'd learnt that a long time ago, because this is someone that I should have stayed away from. But for the last 5 years,
He loves me, really.
For the last 5 years, viewers, I don't know why. Yeah, he always calls me up. Come on, I need to see you. Meet me in town. But I wish I'd learnt my lesson.
I'm sure nobody believes that. Go on.
Because I will admit right here and now, I know nothing about modern dual dialed Rolexes,
Yeah.
the dual cases or dual dials. I can't tell between a factory setting and an aftermarket one, and I'm happy to say that because
It's not your field. It's
I
not
know
what
what
you
I
do.
don't know.
Yeah.
So and I stay away from it. So really, my expertise goes up to essentially the start of this century.
Yeah.
I think after that, it's
All sort of would you
Yeah.
say 5-digit?
five-digit numbers, not 6 digits. Yeah.
Pre-ceramics, all
Yeah.
of the 5-digit.
So what would I mean, there's a lot of vintage collectors out there, James. A lot of people love their vintage watches. I mean, for me, my area of, that holds a little place in my heart is actually a bit earlier than yours. I love the First World War stuff. For
Oh, the
me.
Rebergs.
Yeah, it's,
Oh, God, yeah.
very charismatic, and I've always had a fondness for that stuff. But what advice would you offer anyone that's looking to get into vintage Rolex in particular? What advice would you give them to start off? If you take yourself back to when you first bought your first one, what advice would you give?
No, what was relevant when I first started buying is now utterly irrelevant. What I would say to anybody who's interested in starting to collect Rolex stuff is, one, buy some books or read as much as you can from magazines and stuff. I don't have I'm not going to say, read people who've got major things on the internet, who've got, pages and pages of stuff.
Yeah.
Don't listen to people on forums.
Yeah.
Anybody who, and I speak as somebody who's editor-in-chief of what was at the time the biggest watch forum in the world, Time Zone. But, anybody can write anything.
Exactly.
On the internet. Study, learn. Money spent buying books, buying magazines, time spent reading stuff on the internet or wherever, is going to save you time and money when you go out and start to buy.
It's an investment, isn't it?
It is. And it is by far the best investment you can make in collecting. But on the other hand, what I would say is don't do any of that until after you've bought your first or second Rolex, because until you've bought one or two, you don't actually know what you like. And until you know what you like, it's difficult to decide what the hell you're going to learn about. Because when I was starting, it was possible for me to learn everything there was to know about Rolex because there wasn't that much information out there. Now there is so much. I mean, there are people who are, who specialize in 5513 bezel inserts.
Yeah.
And they know about that one thing, and they know that one thing really, really well. They will probably know more about 5513 bezel inserts than I ever will.
Because they've specialised in that. Yeah.
Mark 1s, Mark 2s.
It's very interesting. James' advice is very interesting. It's very similar to my own in many respects. One of the things that I've always said, James, is find a brand that you like.
Yeah.
Then find a watch within that brand that you like, and then hone into that area.
It's so vast.
Exactly. Otherwise, you can't see the woods for the trees. This is going to be probably an obvious answer, but modern versus vintage. You obviously prefer the vintage, and I'm actually just glancing at what you're wearing. To me, that looks like a 1980s oyster quartz?
Yeah, the two areas that I really like are the 50s and 60s and Rolex oyster quartz.
Yeah.
I love the oyster quartz for two reasons. One, it's obscenely accurate, which is something that actually very few people talk about with watches nowadays. I mean, people are more people know more about the investment value of watches than they do about the accuracy of watches, which is bizarre, really, because I mean that's the sole purpose of watches. But anyway, I love them. I love them for a number of reasons. One is that they are utterly different. In many ways, they don't even look like a Rolex to many people. But thirdly, I love the red-headed stepchilds. You know, I love the weird stuff. You know, for a long time, people would hold their fingers up in the form of a cross when you approach them with an oyster quartz. Oh, God, it's not a real Rolex, it's a bloody quartz. God, what are you thinking about? And so, you know, that to me, that's a good reason to buy them because, you know, if everybody hates them, then they must be doing something right, as far as I'm concerned.
And also the special dials that they put in some of the precious metal models as well.
Yeah.
Malachite, lapis, wood, all stone, you name it.
I'd love, I mean, that sort of stuff I'd love. I mean, to be honest, now, the 3 watches I wear in regular rotation are this steel oyster quartz date just. I've got a white gold day date oyster quartz, and I've got a Louis Vuitton tambour, the new one in steel, blue dial. Those are the 3 watches that most of the time you'll find on my wrist.
Fantastic. Tell us a little bit more about this partnership with you two guys. What's the?
It's not a partnership. I am helping Spencer.
You wouldn't want to be partners with it.
It's not that. I just don't want him partners with me. Rolex upset the apple cart by introducing the certified pre-owned thing, which has really kind of changed a lot of things in the used Rolex market. But the problem is that it, as far as I can tell, it really only goes back to, I haven't seen anybody doing certified pre-owned 1960s, 1970s Rolex.
I've seen, early 90s?
Yeah.
I think sort of Zenith Daytonas, that's about it.
I think it's all sapphire. I don't think...
Yes.
I haven't...
Well, just so you both know, I was in Selfridges on last week, and they've just introduced... They had some acrylic Datejust, 16013s.
Okay.
But they were actually more expensive than the 16233 sapphires. So they are starting to do some what I would class as semi-vintage.
Yeah, but I mean...
Not sports though.
Not that I saw, no.
I count those as transitional because they're quick sets.
Yeah.
And in fact, to me, that's a model that's always intrigued me of these transitional watches. The plastic glass GMT, the plastic glass Datejust with the 3035 movement, quick set date, to me are really interesting because they have a modern movement, where much more precise, much more robust, with the vintage look. To me, those are a great watch. But so what I'm trying to do with Spencer is to provide some sort of certification and validation of vintage pieces, of pieces up to the beginning of this century. So it's not a competition with Rolex CPO, but it's to provide a sort of equal level of reassurance for watches that don't get that reassurance from Rolex.
Absolutely.
So when James met up with me, what I was asking for, I wanted to give customers a certificate where we can say all the details of the watch, whether the dial's been repainted, replacement hands, and the authentication of the vintage watch, especially on sports, because it's such a grey area, and a lot of the time people have no idea about the watch.
So James, you've had a long career, illustrious career. You know, you're sort of retirement now. If Rolex were to call you tomorrow and say, we want to pay you the ultimate compliment, we want you to design a James Dowling Rolex, what would it be? What would it look like?
It would probably be the late 50s, early 60s Datejust with the... No, scrap. Okay, my turn to say cut and go back. Okay, it would probably be something like the 5510 Submariner, which was the first to use the 1530 movement, and which used the old James Bond style case and had the fabulous 369 Explorer dial. So something like that.
Was that no crown guards on the 5510?
No crown guards.
Yeah. Because the 08 was the same, wasn't it?
Well, the 08 was the thin one.
Yeah.
The 08 was the 100 meters. The 5510 was the 200 meters. So,
what changes would you make? What would you do? Any James Dowling adaptations to it?
No, the only thing I'd do would be I would make it. I'd use a modern case, but I would still use the beveled shoulders like the old ones did, and I would. What would I change? No, I think you can't mess around with perfection.
Size, same size.
Yeah. I regularly wear a 36mm watch.
So Rolex, look, if you're listening, never mind James Cameron. I've got James Dowling here. I mean, they'd love it. I mean, I'd be in the queue to buy one tomorrow.
Watches and Wonders. Yeah. April 2020.
We could do a reveal. Spencer, have you got any questions for James before we go?
No, look, as I've always said, James, it's been a pleasure meeting you again, for you doing this with me with the certificates, and look forward to doing more for the customers. And that way we've got a document that specifies exactly how the watch is.
Have you got any books out at the moment, Jay? Anything for sale book-wise? It's all sold out?
If you want to find my writing, usually it's in the magazine QP. I
just picked a book up here in the office, British Military Timepieces, and I open it up to, where are we, page 588, and there we go, about a dozen pages of James Dowling. I mean...
I'm writing about the watch that was used by the British. It's the British equivalent of the Panerai. Most people don't even know that during the Second World War, we had our own version of the Panerai, and of course, being British, ours was bigger.
Was it better?
In honesty, no, but it was more butch.
It was better.
James,
and it has a 369 dial.
I think I bought one of these, and you and I spoke about this back in about 08, 2010.
Yep.
James, just to wrap it up, I think it's been 5 or 6 years.
Sorry, I've just got one more question. Just one more question.
He's always got something else to say.
James, like credit about writing the book and everything. Paul, can I ask you, how many books have you written?
I'm still learning to read, Spencer.
Was that when you were at school?
Exactly. Look, listen, I want to thank
Have
James.
You two ever thought of taking your act on the road? I mean...
We do now and again. We're looking for a third party, actually. James, we're looking for a third party. So if you're not busy, I think we could work quite well together, actually. James, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. I know the viewers are going to find this immensely interesting. It's been 5 or 6 years since I've seen you last at Brian's show. I hope it's not another 5 or 6 years before we see each other again. Thank you for honouring the show today. It's really been appreciated.
You're more than welcome. It was great fun. Thank you.
I wish you good health and all the best.
James, again, where we sort of found this area, after looking out there, I've obviously been I've been selling vintage quite a while, and by teaming up with you and you helping me with these certificates, we actually give value and direct. Sorry, with this, I want to give people the info.
Hold on. Yeah, a bit of brain.
Oh, my brain freeze.
Brain fade.
You know, it's the where the eldest to, and he's the one that's... Right, start that all over again. Okay. James, going back, long career, you know, you're saying you're sort of like retired now, etc., etc. If Rolex were to call you up tomorrow and say, Mr. Dowling, we want to pay you the ultimate compliment, that's it. Let me do that one again.
Yeah.
So I have to do that to make up for him, you see. So James...